Hello, welcome to our study of the Bible book by book. Today we are talking about Exodus. Um, Exodus obviously begins where Genesis left off with the people of Israel in Egypt. And it starts with this passage that in chapter 1, Israel is multiplying. They're having wonderful success in Egypt. They are growing as a nation. But the king, there's a new dynasty really in power. It's not just that a new king came to rule, it's that a new government, a whole new system of government who doesn't know Joseph, came into place. And this king is trying to consolidate power, and he realizes that Israel is a threat. And so he decides that he's going to eliminate that threat through destruction of Israel, because what if we have an enemy? What if we have a war and Israel decides to fight for them? We'd be up a creek. And so he decides that he's going to systematically eliminate this people group. He tries to use the midwives and eliminate baby boys that way through essentially abortions. He's trying to force the Israelites to have abortions if they know it's going to be a boy. But unfortunately for him, the midwives say these women give birth way too fast. I can't get there to do the abortion. And so he just says, okay, well, if the baby's born and it's a boy, throw the baby in the river. This becomes what should be a death nail to Israel, and yet they still thrive and prosper. There are two things that we see in chapter 1. That number one, this Pharaoh and this whole dynasty is anonymous. The reality is that makes it impossible for us to date the Exodus. It's just absolutely impossible. There's no way. There are too many gaps in the history that we don't know. And we just cannot date it. But theologically, what it shows us is this, again, just like in Babylon, if you'll go back a couple of videos and talk about Genesis, where we talk about Genesis, Babylon, the people are trying to make a great name for themselves and fail. So the king of Egypt, who oppresses the people, who opposes God at every turn, who wants to be this supreme ruler, is forgotten. Time and time again, we see this in the Bible. Those who want to elevate themselves and become great and have great names are forgotten. Their names are intentionally left out of the story so that we don't know who they are. That's part of the reason I think that the author of Exodus doesn't write in the name. It's because the author wants us to forget about Pharaoh. I should point out that some people will say that because the city of Ramses is named, obviously that it was Ramses II when who was in charge when the people when the Exodus happened. That's not necessarily true. There are other times where cities are named in the Bible, but they're given more modern names because that's how people would know them at the time of the writing, not necessarily their ancient name. It does happen again and again in the Bible, so just having the names there doesn't really mean anything. And also the genealogies don't actually give you an accurate timeline, so we can't trust those either. They skip around a little bit. There's a lot more to that, but hey, don't have the time right now. Exodus 1 sets you up with Pharaoh, anonymous. And then at the end, we have this story. We begin the story of Moses. Moses becomes the main character. He's raised in Pharaoh's house and yet rebels against Pharaoh to join God. He first tries to, whether he's trying to free the people or not, it looks like he's trying to free the people through his own violent ends. And it doesn't work. And he's exiled. And then he has an encounter with God. And this is Exodus chapter 3, this great story of how Moses has this wonderful encounter with God's presence at the bush. We see that God sets up this whole structure, and we learn who God is. The name that is given, we pronounce it, well, we don't know how to pronounce it, but many today will pronounce it with an A and a W, or an A and an E sounds, which becomes Yahweh or Yahweh. This He who is, or the one who is, which actually, ironically, God says not to Moses, He who is, but I am, which means that the only one who can really pronounce God's name truly, authentically, is God. God's the only one who can truly say, I am, which is the name that we are given. It's kind of one of these where humanity keeps trying to take God's role. Genesis chapter 3, humanity keeps trying to take on God's role. Well, here, God shows the only one who can truly even be named, or who can pronounce God's name, is God. This is just one of those subtleties of the Bible that's really great. But we learn about holiness and separation in chapter 3, and Moses is commissioned to go back to Egypt and free the people, because God has heard their cries, heard their voices, and they are going to be free. And this leads us to the major conflict of Exodus. We know the plagues, the 10 great plagues. There are 3 cycles of 3 plagues. One, the first cycle is the least severe in some ways. They become increasingly more severe, but they're all designed to kind of combat the Egyptian gods. I got to admit, I love the cartoon versions of the plagues. I don't know. They're so morbid sometimes to think about that I like the kids' story versions. They help me to just, okay, let's put this into context. But we have this idea that through Moses, God is going to combat not just the people of Egypt, not just the king of Egypt, but the entire religious and civic structure of Egypt. And this is why slaves in their narratives in American history, slaves took on this idea of they are Israel being liberated from oppressors. Because it's not simply freedom. It is God saying the entire structure that this political entity is built around, this social entity, is wrong. So when in American history, when slaves took on this mentality, it's not simply that these individual people are going to be freed. It is the slaves recognizing God is going to say to their oppressors, your entire system, everything you have built on, is a lie. And I'm going to oppose it. That is essentially the great aspect of the story of the plagues of Egypt. That God is going to give a resounding no to everything about Egypt and free the people to create a new society for blessing. I should also say that one of the things that we see in this passage that many people have issues with is that Pharaoh hardens his heart. Or that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. We see it a few times that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. I like in the Bible Project video how they talk about the fact that Pharaoh's the first one to harden his heart. In other words, what we see in the biblical text is sometimes, especially in Hebrew, God is given credit for human decisions. Like Pharaoh decides to harden his heart, and he's going to work against God. But God's given credit for that in some ways. What we have is this give and take of God's sovereignty and human freedom, where the human Pharaoh has decided, I am going to live this way. I'm going to work this system. This is my way. And God knows it. And God is working against that system. And the more God works against that system, the more hardened into that system Pharaoh is going to become. Because Pharaoh is committed to the system. Pharaoh is committed to the lifestyle, to the oppression. And as God works against that, Pharaoh is just going to double down every time. That should be a warning to us as we think about, am I committed to God or am I committed to Pharaoh? Because if we're committed to Pharaoh, every time God doubles down, every time God pushes against the system, we're going to double down in the oppression, the hatred, the violence. It's only when we recognize God is sending plagues that we can escape it. I think it was Tim Keller said something to the effect of, we can only recognize God's freedom when we recognize that we are actively opposing it. That's just wonderful. We can only recognize we can only truly understand God's freedom as we truly understand where we're opposing it. And we are opposing it in many ways, still to this day in our society. We don't often recognize where we are Pharaoh, pushing against God. But these plagues, they're meant to show us how God is going to oppose the systems. So we have the 3 cycles of the plagues. And finally, Pharaoh looks at Moses and says, get out of here. And Moses takes this vast number. We're told 600,000. Again, not necessarily an accurate number. Nobody's quite sure what the number would be. But if you take 600,000 men, which is what it's counted, that's a population estimate of about 2 million people. Just for reference, it takes them a month to get to Sinai. I think it's a staggering number, but I think it's like if they were walking 50 abreast, the first people would reach Sinai and the last people would not have left Egypt yet. They would not even have packed their bags yet. So we know that the 2 million number, the 600,000 number, is probably some sort of hyperbole, but nobody really understands why or what we're reading wrong or anything like that. So it's not an accurate number historically, but there's probably some significance there that I don't understand. At least there might be a scholar who does, and I haven't read it yet. But we'll see. We should also notice that it's not simply one bloodline leaving Egypt. There are a lot of hangers-on. There's a lot of Egyptians and other people groups that are leaving with this core, this nucleus of Israelites. Historically speaking, what we might have, and some scholars have suggested this, is that some Israelites stayed in Egypt, others went back to Canaan. And when we have the Exodus, these other people groups attach themselves onto Israel and become Israel. And as they move into Canaan, they are joined by other Israelites. In other words, what we're seeing theologically is that God is creating a nation. Historically, really, there's a lot of people groups, not simply one bloodline. We are focusing on the family because God's people is always meant to be a family. but there's many peoples making up that family. I hope that made sense. But we get to the Red Sea, and this is the boundary marker, not just geographically. Again, modern Egypt, we think of the Red Sea as a geographical boundary. This was also theological for the Egyptians. This was the border where their gods were in charge. In other words, their gods kept this wall so that nobody could get in or out. This is where Egypt is sovereign. And you'll remember, if you've watched the Ten Commandments, the movie, like I have, you remember Charlton Heston raising his hands, and the waters part in the middle, and these huge columns of water go up. Whether or not that's true, I don't care. I like to visualize it that way. I think, I like that. There is symbolism going on here that God, through Moses, controls the boundaries of Egypt. The Egyptian gods no longer control those borders. It's now Moses and God's people who control the borders. And then the borders close on the Egyptian army. Again, to say God is in control of the borders, and the Egyptians who want to kill and destroy the people of Israel have no power to do so. They have no authority. They can't do it. And so the first half of the book ends with this great poem, Exodus 15. This poem retelling what happened in the story for us as we imagine the people of Israel being saved and taken out from oppression into God's new kingdom. This is the wonder, the majesty of the book of Exodus. And now that the people are on the other side of oppression, they're going to build the nation. And so that's what we will pick up with next in the next video as the people of God begin to build their nation.